Welcome to this RICOMET webinar on the societal aspects and marketing challenges related to norm in building materials. This webinar is co-organized by the SHARE platform, by the RadoNorm project, and by the European Norm Association. I am Robbe Geysmans from the Belgian Nuclear Research Institute, and I will be your moderator today. Before we turn to our panelists, which are gathered here in the webinar, I will very shortly go through some of the practicalities. First of all, you should know that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available afterwards on the SHARE website. Second, as an audience member, you are not able to use your microphone or your webcam. However, you can communicate with us through the chat function. So you find the chat function at the bottom of the Zoom interface. My colleague Tanja Perko will keep an eye on that and will make sure that any comments or questions which are being raised will also be brought to us. And then thirdly, I will very shortly go through the structure of today's webinar. So we will start by hearing our 6 panelists who will each present their views on today's topic. After that, we will turn to a group discussion and we will open the floor to questions from the audience. So for that, please use the chat function once again. And then the webinar will be closed by Karen Smith, who is also with us in a short wrap up and look forward. I will already introduce Mrs. Karen Smith. So Karen Smith is an environmental scientist at the Argonne National Laboratory in the USA. And besides that, she is also the chair of the steering committee of the IEA's Network on Environmental Management and Remediation, the EnviroNet network. And she's the former chair of the EnviroNet Norm project. Okay, so with these announcements made, we can turn to the first presentation from our first panelist, which is Wouter Schroeyers. He will provide an introduction to today's topic and build on the challenges identified by the Norm for Building project. Dr. Schroeyers is a professor in nuclear technology at Hasselt University in Belgium and was also the chair of the Cost Action Norm for Building, which ran from 2014 until 2017. Wouter, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. So today I will talk a little bit about some results of the Norm for Building project. We will talk primarily about some challenges that we identified. First of all, as a brief introduction, as you all know without any doubt that natural occurring radionuclides are all around us. They are present in the soil, which means that they are also present in all the materials that we will gain from the soil. They're present in plants, in our bodies, in gases like radon, like you know, that come from the soil. And radon is actually a part of one of the natural decay chains, namely the decay chain from uranium-238. And there are other decay chains around, and of course, very long-living radionuclides like potassium-40. But so we know now that natural occurring radionuclides are present in the soil and all the materials that we gain from the soil. So that means if you are going to process these ores, that you can end up with residues that have enhanced concentrations of natural occurring radionuclides. And if they are above specific legislative levels, then we can call them NORM, natural occurring radioactive materials. And it's all in the terminology. If I speak about residues, that gives a certain connotation. But I could also mention waste or byproducts. And if we talk about the one or the other, people might look at it differently. I'm showing here in the images some typical examples like red mud and phosphogypsum. But you know that these materials and many others that are sometimes considered to be norm can have very interesting technical properties. If we do it in a right way, they can become valuable secondary resources, for example, for the use in construction materials. And there is a good motivation why we should use some of these materials for construction materials. Because consider the example of ordinary Portland cement. It is responsible for a large fraction of the global carbon dioxide emissions. And if we are going to replace this type of cement, by other types of cement, sometimes called alkali activated materials or geopolymers or inorganic polymers. So we use different types of cementitious binders. Well, then we can reduce some of these carbon dioxide emissions. And these type of materials can also allow recycling many types of residues. So it can be quite interesting. It can be a good reason to consider this type of recycling. However, can we do that in a safe way? We have to consider the chemical and the physical properties. We have to consider potential gamma exposure towards the occupants and workers. And also the session before noon talked about indoor air quality. Also here, radon, that is of course a part of this natural decay chain, can come up. So we have to consider, when we look at the indoor air quality, both the radiological, but also the chemical noxes. And also we have to look at construction materials, what's going to happen at the end of life. So these are all very important considerations that were dealt with in a previous cost action called Norm for Building. We investigated the reuse of many types of byproducts in new types of building materials that are still under development. Like I have to stress, sometimes you can almost use that you're about 99% of your residues, and that becomes the building material. But of course, at that stage, it's very important to evaluate from a radiation protection point of view if you should. In this network, we looked at radiological, technical, legislative, ecological, economical, many different aspects. However, we did not really have many social scientists or risk communication related experts on board in the cost action norm for building. So this aspect was not covered in much. And we identified many challenges related to this aspect. How do we perceive radiological risks regarding the reuse of norm in construction material? How can we deal, if we have an idea about the risk perception, how can we deal with this in our communication? What are the different stakeholders' views regarding the reuse of norm in construction? Is this accepted on the market? There is even problems regarding accepting waste as a general. So this is a difficult issue already by itself. And how can we translate our knowledge towards workers to gain a specific radiation protection behavior? So these are all challenges that we are facing and that we're going to further deal in this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Wouter. Yeah, thank you. So next up is Rob Wiegers. I will put his slides up already. Okay. So Rob is the Managing Director at IBR Consult. He is the current Vice President of the European Norm Association, and he's also a member of the high-level steering group on raw materials at the European Union. Mr. Wiegers will talk about industrial and market perspectives on norm in building products. And Mr. Wiegers, you have the word. Could you also unmute your microphone, please?
Yep.
Thank you.
You can hear me now, I hope.
Yes,
okay, great. Well, thank you, Robbe. I will further elaborate on the points raised by Wouter. Maybe the next slide. Thanks. It is, of course, impossible in 5 minutes to address all the aspects, so I will pinpoint some of them without claiming to be complete. There are generic aspects for reuse, social impact, legislation, sustainability, which is the driver for you to develop and put on the market a new norm-related product. We have to look into economy, potential, the risk. To put a point on that, when you develop a product from scratch to working industry, a working process, it can take 5 to 10 years. And in the meantime, of the 5 or 10 years, legislation can change, and therefore the specifications you need to require, either for product or process, can change. And in the worst case, it can mean that you have to start all over again or just terminate it. You need to have permits, and you have also look into the game. Next slide, please. I give here a very simple structure of the stakeholders in the building industry. You have the raw material suppliers, the production of building products, let's say the ceramic brick factories, the construction industry, the architects, the users, the authorities, etc., and all interact in a certain way with each other. And I do think that other speakers will address this point. It is very important aspect of perception, even or especially when you use waste products or norm products. And being aware of this complex structure, you can make your choices and you have to be aware of it. Otherwise, if you do think it is only a matter of technical aspects, then things will not happen and will terminate at the early point of development. And next slide, please. And of course, you have social aspects, you have the structure in which you will have to work, but you also have the competition. The competitors can be both internal and external. The internal competitor is often the marketing department, who thinks their work and life is complicated enough without your new product, and they try to terminate it in an early stage. But once you reach the mark, you have to face the fact that your competitors, the products already available, are well-known products, already have a market share, clients know how to use it, and often already invested in terms of products produced already, invested in terms of their working people who used to work with the materials, as well as investment in equipment being able to use these materials. Well, important is, of course, when you use a new product that you not know about the risks of the application. You know them about the normal products, the current products, and so you have to fight that aspect as well. And of course, all kinds of services are already given by the current producers. And if you want to have some idea about it, then you have to go to a site of them and look into the technical aspects, and you can see what huge amount of information they already gathered about their product, what services they have, etc. Next slide, please. Then I go to my 5 minutes presentation conclusions. Well, the first is very important. Product development is much more than lab work and performing interesting analysis. It's a time and money consuming activity. Lots of expertises are involved, and some will be raised in the next presentations. Competition is fierce in the market. The building market especially is conservative, which means that all the aspects I already mentioned and many more you have to address and be aware of that. That will be kept against you if you start a new product. And be aware that only a small percentage of the promising developments will become a commercial success. So product development is the most interesting and important activity. I do it for the last 40 years. But only when you involve all these aspects, you can expect to be successful. So far, and thank you, Robbe, for the sheets.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Wiegers. I will now start sharing another presentation by Britt-Marie Drottz-Sjöberg. Okay. So our next presenter is Professor Britt-Marie Drottz-Sjöberg, who will present on the issue of risk communication. Dr. Drottz-Sjöberg is a professor at the Department of Psychology of the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, and she's also a member of the Royal Swedish Academy of Engineering Sciences. The floor is yours, Dr. Drottz-Sjöberg.
Thank you very much, Robbe. Yes, I've been asked to say something about risk perception and communication. It's a field that I have been working with for some time. Next, please. The most important thing in those general terms is that you have a clear view of what should be a good communicator, what type of situation you are dealing with, And what is the goal of the communication? So a good communicator has to know the field, the overall context, the subject matter, of course, and the type of people or recipients, the groups or the individuals that you are addressing, so that they can be informed or discussed with in a language that they understand. I will also make a point of dividing very simply into two areas: when there is no risk as the experts see it, and when there is some kind of risk or hazard involved. The common goal, of course, or the central goal, is that when you communicate, you need to have a good strategy for that, so that you don't damage any kind of trust you already have, or that you can build trust and maintain the trust to those you are discussing with. Next, please. This is a very simple overview, which I think gives some kind of view of when there is a hazardous material or situation, you have, or the society has, the experts, the authorities that are needed for that situation. They are there from the beginning. There are also laws and regulations involved in what to do. If this can be informed to producers and end users when it comes to building materials, this is just a very general sketch of how you expect the situation to unfold. Next, please. So the horizontal line here is that you gain trust by this usually unchallenged path from experts, legislation authorities, and in that situation, people, companies, etc., actors on the market, they expect that there are functioning controls. So usually we don't talk very much about functioning controls, but that's why the arrows are dotted on the above line. Next, please. This is a more complicated figure. I've borrowed it from research in 2006. And if you concentrate on the vertical circles saying current knowledge, information need, and risk perception, you can see there are arrows going to and from them. And when it comes to perceiving risk, you need to have the information about there is a risk. If you do perceive a risk, you you try to get information about it. But if, again, you don't see a risk, there is not usually a problem. And you will be surprised if there is a problem that you were not informed about. So this figure shows information seeking when it comes to the plus and minuses relative the arrows. You can see what is when people are looking for information and when they are not. Next, please. So this is an extension of this model I've been doing as an example of what can happen if you have, if you include also the market acceptance of a product, for example. So given that you have trust that is not challenged in any way, and people do not see, or users do not see any risk with the product or a situation, you will have this blue line at the bottom going directly from trust to acceptance in the market. However, if that is challenged and you see the red lines, it goes to risk perception and it goes into the system of seeking information. On the top right corner, you see no information or knowledge of the risk. If there is such there is no knowledge, or if there is no information, you can actually expect people to trust that there is no problem. We did a study many years ago about the safety data sheets, where we actually included information in some aspects and excluded it in others to see the effect of what is the effect of missing information. And the overall result of that was that if you have no information about risk, then people don't think about it or react to it. And that is, of course, very good if there is no risk. It's a big problem if there is a risk. I hope this can give some kind of overview of one of the central problems in risk communication. I put it together in the last slide, please. So here you have a very simple table of two types of situations where there is no hazard or risk, or where there is actual hazard or risk. And on the left hand, you have the perception. There is no perceived risk, or there is a perceived risk. So you have these four very simplified situations where there is no risk and people do not perceive risk. So here you can have, of course, an ordinary situation where authorities, experts, and other responsible authorities or informers have information to provide if there is something happening, but otherwise it's just there to be looked at or found in cases of risk. So if there is perceived risk but no actual risk or hazard, it is a situation where you should inform. And there are lots of communication strategies of how to do that, depending on who is the group or person who want to have information. On the column to the right, you have the actual hazard or risk. And here, there are two different situations. So when there is no actual risk, as stated by experts, there is still very important that there is information available to be found or to be looked up by those interested. And on the bottom right, you have the perceived risk where there is actual hazard or risk. There you have to be very active when it comes to both information and communication strategies. And I make a distinction between information, which is usually one way, and communication strategies where you actually have a much more, not eye to eye, not always, but you have a back and forth communication with those who are concerned or worried. So that is my part of the presentation. I hope that can be a basis for discussion later on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Britt-Marie. Our next presenter is Kelly Jones. Kelly is a specialist in radiation protection at Public Health England. She is also a member of the British Standards Institute, and she's also the UK expert on the European Commission Working Group for the Standard on the Dose Assessment of Gamma Radiation. Mrs. Jones will speak about legislative aspects connected to norm in building materials. So the floor is yours, Kelly.
Thank you very much. Just to check you can hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. So one aspect that can obviously improve customer customer confidence is if they're confident that there's the appropriate regulations. So I'm just going to give a very brief overview of some of the relevant safety standards. So obviously the fundamental radiation protection safety standard is the IAEA basic safety standard. And in that there's a requirement that relates to radionuclides in commodities and specifically mentions construction materials. And that regulation talks about that the dose to the what they call the representative person, the person most likely to be highly exposed, and it's got phrasing, it says generally does not exceed a value of about 1 millisievert. Also, back in 2015, the IECA produced a guidance document that also proposed the use of a screening tool to help identify those building materials that might be subject to restriction, and talked about an activity concentration index. And I'm going to come on to that in the next couple of slides. So I know that we have a wider audience than just European colleagues, but I thought it was useful to talk about how this was implemented in Europe. Back in 2013 now, the Euratom directive came out. And in this directive, there's a specific article which relates to gamma radiation for building materials. And again, it talks about having that a reference level shall be 1 millisievert for indoor external exposure. It also talks about before building materials are placed on the market, that there are certain things that should be done. And it talks about activity concentrations for certain radionuclides, which I'll come on to in the next slide, are measured. And it says that where requested by the competent authority, these measurements, these activity concentrations should be made available to them, as well as other information that's relevant to determine exposure, for example, the density of the material, how it's going to be used, that type of thing. And in the directive, a list of likely building materials that might cause concern from a radiological point of view was provided. Annex 8 of the directive gives a what it calls a conservative screening tool. Screening tool. And basically is a way of that people can demonstrate compliance with this reference level of 1 millisievert. So basically, if you go away and you measure activity concentrations of radium-226 and thorium-232 and potassium-40, all these naturally occurring radionuclides, and you compare them to the ratios given on this slide, and you demonstrate that it's less than 1, then you can argue that your material is compliant. I'm not going to go through all the different legislation for all the different European countries, you'll be glad to know, but I think it's generally speaking, some countries have specified a reference level of 1 millisievert in legislation, and other countries have also specified this activity concentration index in their legislation as well. It does vary from country to country. Just to move on to the construction product regulations, which is another set of regulations which is very pertinent to the subject that we're talking about today. These regulations were introduced back in 2011 as a way of trying to harmonise the marketing of construction products, trying to make sure that it was kind of standard across Europe. And it refers to dangerous substances, but there's also a section which refers to dangerous radiation. So to help producers kind of demonstrate compliance and harmonisation, a couple of standards are being developed by the European Commission for Standardisation. First one is about how you go about measuring the activity concentrations for the radium, thorium and potassium-40. And this standard is very well advanced, and there's a validation of the method is ongoing, but it should be completed in the next year or two. The more challenging standard actually is about the dose assessment, because actually this is a bit different from what's normally done for these type of standards. So typically these will be, you're making measurements for, not just radionuclides, but it could be other sites of chemicals, that types of thing. But it's unusual to have a standard which relates to assessing exposures. The other challenging thing for this standard as well is that the European Basic Safety Standard relates to when you're calculating your dose to compare against your reference level 1 millisievert, that applies to the whole building, whereas these construction product regulations just are about specific products. So the challenge that has been for this standard is basically a way of calculating the doses for the specific product, but then also taking account of the fact that you have to take account of other things that are in that building as well. So there's a draft that is very well developed, but it's still draft at this stage, but hopefully will go out for wider consultation fairly shortly. So how is this all going to be implemented? So obviously the European Commission itself is going to look at how all of these, how all of the European countries, including the UK. The UK said we'd sign up and we'd implement the Euratom 2013. How these are going to be put into regulation, and obviously when these SEND standards, the measurement of activity concentration, and the dose assessment actually come into place. Producers of building materials will need to demonstrate compliance with them in order to get their CE marking. I just thought I'd very briefly mention there's also an organisation called RICOMET, which is basically brings together radiation protection authorities in different European countries, and this has already held a workshop on building materials, and it's going to continue to discuss and review the implementation of these regulations. So we're obviously very much focused on radiation, but we have to be aware that building products, this is just one of the hurdles they have to jump over. There are other issues that they have to think about, and the CPR legislation covers other dangerous substances, and there's other requirements on them, for example, the leach testing and that type of thing. I'm sure there are many more directives that they have to cover, but I just thought I'd mention the REACH directive, where you basically have to, if you're using certain chemicals, you have to provide data about the chemicals that are in your products as well. So as I say, that's just very brief touching on that, just to talk about some of the legislative aspects of norming building materials.
Okay, thank you, Kelly. Our fifth panelist is Miguel Ángel Sanjuan, who is the head of the Cements and Mortars area at the Spanish Institute of Cement and its Applications, and he's also an associate professor at the Technical University of Madrid. He will speak about norm in building products from an industrial perspective. So if you could just please start sharing your presentation, Miguel Ángel, and then the floor is yours.
Sorry. Okay, thank you for the introduction. I'm going to speak about the introduction of this norm in building materials. Well, as Kelly Jones has introduced, the European regulation is based in the Euratom directive, in the construction product regulation, but also recently in the European Green Deal. This is a group, a pack of new regulations related to the aim to be climate neutral in the 2050 in Europe. And one of these ways is to use new materials, new wastes of byproducts or any residue to be introduced in the construction materials. Well, the aim to be climate neutral in 2050 is one lever to achieve this climate neutrality, and also is part of the circular economy strategy developed in many countries, not only in Europe. This is a great opportunity to introduce these raw materials in the construction products. Why? As has been said before, there is a risk, a radiation risk, but how we have all the tools necessary to screen tools in order to distinguish materials having a risk, but also materials that we can use directly in construction products. For instance, we have a great experience in using coal fly ash and blast furnace slag, also in ceramic and in concrete and in cement. And well, we have more than 50 years experience, and well, the consumers are used to put in the construction well, in buildings and civil construction, to use this kind of norm materials. Well, another way to implement these norm materials is via the road maps. This is a current way developed for many construction associations in order to say how they are going to be climate neutral in 2050 or by 2050. And in these road maps, one way, one great level is to put these norm materials used as raw materials in the construction products. As I said, well, in cement, concrete, ceramic, and so on. This is a great opportunity, and norm materials have a marketing needs that you should use. Also, we should take into account that these materials regarding the European Green Deal packet probably will be compulsory to use a percentage of waste materials in the new construction products. For instance, in several countries, for instance, in Colombia, I know that several town halls of big cities is compulsory to use at least 20% of recycled aggregates. And this is pushing in two ways, that they want to promote the circular economy, but also they want to enhance the reduction of CO2 emissions. Finally, I will underline several points. First of all, in Europe, but also in other countries, the idea is to implement at least a percentage of recycling in construction products. In Europe, the regulation, as Kelly Jones said, is the construction product regulation, but also in other countries, at the national level and local level, are implementing a recycling percentage in several ways. This will enhance the circular economy. That is a good strategy from the economy point of view, but also social and technical point of view. And one way is use blended construction or building materials. This must be implemented also in the building codes and standards, because, well, the legislation sometimes is coming a little bit late. For instance, we have in this moment the Green Deal legislation in Europe, but our standards are not including these norm materials. Some of them, as I said before, we have fly ashes, we have slag, blast furnace slag, but there are other slags that can be implemented. And finally, if the norm material are over the limit, the screen, using the screen tool of the index, the activity index, it's possible to mix these materials with other materials, natural materials, in order to comply the requirements regarding the radioactivity. For instance, probably you know that coal fly ash, some of them, they are over 1 regarding the index, the IAR index. And if you use a cement or a concrete with this material, this level is reduced. And that's all of my presentation. Thank you for attending.
Thank you, Miguel Ángel. Our final presenter is Gaston Meskens, who will present some of the ethical considerations which need to be taken into account when considering the use of norm in building products. Gaston Meskens is a nuclear physicist and a philosopher working both at the Belgian Nuclear Research Center and at Ghent University. So Gaston, you have the word.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Okay, so thanks to the organizers to invite me to share some thoughts on ethics also in the context of this webinar on building products containing naturally occurring radioactive materials. I see this presentation more as some kind of bridge, maybe between the previous presentations and the final discussion and the reflections, and also respond to the questions. When we talk about ethics, if you do a Google image search on ethics, you get lots of things. For instance, these two examples are very typical. People say ethics is about right versus wrong. Others are more sophisticated in talking about values like integrity, principles, honesty, fairness, and so on. Well, the first conclusion we can already make, or maybe consideration, is that ethics is about much more, and actually about something else than simply questions of right versus wrong. And also for like building materials and norm, in a norm context, I think this is the case. Because after all, what is the problem? The problem is that we are dealing with a risk, some kind of collective health risk due to radioactivity. And then the idea will be that justifying and dealing with a collective health risk is a matter of ethics. But it is an ethics that should inspire and instruct science, policy, and the market. And of course, as we know, science will always have some kind of central role in making sense of the problem as such, but it cannot always help us to really judge or evaluate ethical issues. And if we talk about a health risk, of course, we talk about a specific health risk that is completely different as, for instance, the risk of a nuclear accident of a nuclear power plant. While that is like non-existing or potentially existing and then suddenly emerges in a very dramatic way, a health risk coming with norm is of course a low to very low health risk, but it is permanently there and it can take all routes from soils to materials to wastes and so on. So that's something to really take into account. Another difference between a health risk of norm versus, for instance, a nuclear accident is that while a nuclear accident might be in time and distance far away from the people, from citizens, this kind of health risk of coming with norm, use of norm, is coming very close to us and actually surrounds us every day, as a matter of saying. So taking into account all these things, I think thinking of ethics is relevant in a few subjects, topics or themes. And I see three of them. It's justification, it's information and risk perception, and it's science as policy advice. Justification of the use of building products containing naturally occurring radioactive material is the justification of the risk that is coming with it, with this use. And that can have lots of points of attention in ethics. Ecological, of course, in terms of sustainability, the reuse of byproducts or residues in building materials as waste, decommissioning. If you reuse byproducts or residues, we're of course recycling, and that in terms of sustainability is a good thing, might be seen as a solution. On the other hand, by this reuse, we are actually also technically enhancing the radioactivity levels, and by that we also create a new problem. So it's a matter of balancing by just trying to find out what would be the right thing to do. Another ethical issue is the right to information and informed consent of the potentially affected, in this case, citizens. Another point of attention would be radiological protection as a policy. We know the three classical pillars are justification, optimization, and dose limitation. Especially in occupational context, of course, risks coming with norm can be very significant. And I invite the participants here to also, if you haven't done it yet, to check the ICRP publication 138, Ethical Foundation of the System of Radiological Protection. This publication talks about sets of values that can be relevant also in this context. Concerning the private sector, of course, ethics is talking about good practices, transparency, accountability, and also in this private sector, companies or organizations may have ethical charters really referring to this kind of responsible behavior. And last but not least, the act or process of governance itself has ethical dimensions. The making and interpretation of regulation itself, such as the basic safety standards or other relevant law and soft law, is a matter of ethics because of lots of interpretations are there, and it's a policy process that would need to lead to some kind of consensus. And I see law always as some kind of pragmatic simplification of ethical considerations. We decide on a level, we decide on a norm based on scientific insights, and then ethics will start beyond these limits of the law, so to speak. The second category, information and risk perception. We, for instance, have a typical dilemma here. Should we give the public factual information on the radioactivity of the building materials, or shouldn't we alarm them? Is it, or don't unnecessarily alarm people? And here we can make a very interesting comparison with naturally occurring radionuclides in bottled water, for instance, sourced water from sources. We know that many of these bottled waters have a higher concentration in radionuclides than typical tap water from, and then should we inform the people about that? Do they have the right to know? On the other hand, we know that the first company that will put the radioactivity levels on the labels of their bottles will go bankrupt immediately. So what is the dilemma we have to, how to approach this kind of things? Last but not least, and this is a very important aspect, I think, ethical considerations coming with science as policy advice. Science in its role of advising policy, also towards the market. And the challenge is very typical, and not only typical for norm, but typical in dealing with low levels of radioactivity in public space. It's dealing with uncertainty and value-based opinions, while under pressure of politics and the market to deliver evidence it cannot or cannot always deliver. And I think of a comparison with the COVID-19 pandemic is very relevant here, because also here we see scientific experts being under extreme pressure to deliver evidences, struggling with uncertainties and value-based opinions. Of course, in the norm case, the pressure is not that high in the sense of acute now, but of course in the long term, trying to really construct policy, it is an issue to take into account. Okay, second and last part of my presentation, ethics in practice. What is it, ethics in practice? Is it about fairness? Is it a matter of objectively balancing specific interests? We see the Greek goddess of Themis here with a typical balance. In other versions, she's blindfolded in order to, as a metaphor for objectivity. But it's not about balance. I mean, ethics is not about balancing things, because in most cases, there is nothing to balance because interests might be like completely comparable. And in that sense, we could see ethics as dealing with a typical foundation problem. You have an argument and a counter argument, and both parties cannot prove that the other one is wrong. So you have to make an ethical choice. Science can describe the options, but not help us to make a choice. And I think this example of information to the public is the best example in this case. Should we give factual information on radioactivity in building materials, or shouldn't we unnecessarily alarm the public? So the importance of dialogue becomes key and I know this is like some kind of a spiritual approach to ethics, but it's a spiritual approach that can or should instruct concrete policy and governance processes. The importance of dialogue, and this is my last slide. It's the importance of formal dialogue. We know in dealing with the risk of norm in building products, science, of course, still has a central role to play, but it cannot always help us to make ethical policy choices. And generally said, if nobody has the truth about a shared concern, then the only way out is being prepared to have an open conversation about it. So fair risk governance, also in the norm context, is governance of which the methods of dialogue and negotiation are trusted as fair by anyone concerned, the potentially affected, the stakeholders, society in general. I mean, to make a comparison with democracy, I think accepting something you don't like because you know that the method was used to make the decision is fair is the ultimate criterion of democracy. And we can also apply this to ethical dialogues. And as the philosopher Philip Kitcher says, there are no ethical experts. The only authority is the authority of conversation. So to conclude, I think it would be beneficial, some kind of accountability towards society, that the sector, the industrial sector of norm, would open up more proactively towards society and care for at least participation in formal dialogues. Policy, the science, civil society policy nexus, taking into account that civil society includes the private sector representations. And why not reaching out to the public information and participation, sensing opinion and perception of people, for instance, through focus groups. And I share some kind of references also for you with this background information. So I thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Gaston, and thank you to all of our presenters. So before turning to questions for the audience, I would also like to use my position as a moderator to maybe present a topic up for reflection to our panelists. More precisely, I would like to bring up this issue of transparency and communication, which was very explicitly present in the last presentation of Gaston and also in Britt-Marie's presentation, but I think implicitly ties to all the presentations that we have heard here today. So I would just very briefly like to ask our panelists to reflect on the questions of what should be communicated regarding norm in building products, who or which stakeholders should be involved in this communication and why. So I think we can adhere to the order of the presentations as we have done until now, but of course feel free to react to each other's statements, also to the audience, so you can use the chat to do that. So Wouter, can you be the first to react on that?
Well, if it's regarding the question who should be informed, well, I think, of course, information should be available on one hand, publicly available, but of course, the most important is that also the people that are producing the different types of construction materials or building products, that they are well aware of the regulations. And I think that can sometimes entangle a kind of a campaign so that they are aware of it, because in some countries, it is regulated at different levels. For example, in Belgium, we have like at the, let's say, the regional governments, they deal with all kinds of metals, with all kinds of chemical hazards. That radioactivity is dealt by the federal government. So that's dealt at a different level. So it's very important that actually from the point of view of the people that make the construction materials, that they have a clear overview, that they can have an idea about chemical and radiological issues. And that is, I think, a very important aspect, to put things in perspective. To also, if many of the residues we are considering do not only have radiological issues, but also sometimes much more important chemical issues of other aspects that can also have an important impact on the building product quality. And these are also extremely important aspects to consider. One should consider always the whole picture, let's say.
Okay, thank you, Wouter. We can now move to Rob. Please unmute your microphone, Rob. Thank you.
I always forget it. Well, thank you. I would like to look to it from a different point of view. When I look to building materials, a lot of risks are involved. Construction is basically safety matter, not as much a technical matter. For example, building products and raw materials have to fulfill REACH. Do we want to inform the user of a building on all the risks involved? And we are focusing on chemical and radiation risks. There are many more risks, etc. Or do we need to think that the people should have some trust? I know it is not a popular theme at the moment, but have some trust to authorities that they will have to take care of. And once it is put on the market, they can go, they can assume that the application is safe, because we are focusing now on radiation. As said, there are many, many risks. Will we bother them with all? And if so, are they able to weigh all those risks? Only if you say, well, this is risk, that is risk, that do we make them happy? Give them, do we actually give them a tool to address all those risks? If not, we only make them unhappy and not only assuming that we give them some information. So who should be informed? I do think that the user should be informed in a very generic way, but that the authorities, the duty of the authorities is to evaluate all the risk and to make sure that only products receive the market which are safe. And having said that, and that's my last remark, that's a discussion we often have, is there is no situation with no risk. So the people must be aware that whatever they do, always risks are involved. That's my last remark.
Okay, thank you, Rob, for your vision on this. Next is then Britt-Marie. What's your vision on this? And maybe you can also react to Rob if there's anything that you might want there.
Yes, do you hear me? Can you hear me now?
No, we do.
You do? Okay.
Yes.
I think...
yes, we hear you, yeah.
Yes, it's a long time since the discussion when you discussed if people should be informed or not. The question is, I suppose, when people want to be informed. But let's go to the questions. As I said in my presentation, I believe it's important that information is available if somebody wants information. Then if the authorities or experts are trusted, you don't have a problem of how to communicate. The problems come when authorities or experts are mistrusted or not necessarily the ones you ask for information. And then you have a certain problem of how to deal with that, in addition to how to inform and give the correct information. But to have information available, I suppose, is the basic thing. And then it depends on the situation. If you are active in your information, campaigning for something, or just making clear who is responsible, who should be, who can respond to questions, and how responsibilities are divided up, for example, between various actors, if that should be a question. And that, of course, changes depending on who is the person or group or actor who wants information or who is worried about something. I think it's a very good point that making producers aware of regulations that Wouter said. That's an example of how specific groups may have a need for specific information. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Britt-Marie. Next up is Kelly Jones.
Yes, I suppose just to agree with the other panelists that I think a lot of it is making technical information available to those who want it, but also being clear about who's in charge of the regulations. Sometimes it can, it cannot be clear who's properly who's in charge of making sure that these, you're meeting the construction product regulations, for example. I know in the UK, we're obviously looking at this in quite a lot of detail because of what the dreadful Grenfell fire, where some of the products met the standards, but they were used inappropriately. And there was a lack of, I think, oversight of how some of those products were used. So I think we've had a loss of consumer confidence because of that. And so it's about making sure it's very clear who's regulating these products. So that's all I'd like to say.
Okay, thank you, Kelly. Miguel, Ángel.
Hi. Well, in my opinion, I think that currently transparency is asked for administration and for society in general. And then, in my opinion, it's good to inform about the radioactivity of these new materials or this norm used in construction materials. Then, well, the easy way we have in this moment is using the activity concentration index that the Euratom directive proposed. And this is a screening tool, quite easy to use and quite easy to inform about it. Then if we have a ceramic or a concrete or any construction material, and we test about against this activity concentration index, it's quite easy to say that, well, this is safe, that's all. Or if a technical person asks for more information about uranium, thorium, potassium, and so on, well, this information also, in my opinion, should be available. But at least to give easy tools or easy information for the users, the consumers, because this give confidence to use these materials. It's good to be transparent and to give information, at least in a simple way. Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel, Ángel. Gaston, you're the final one up.
Yeah, about transparency, I think when we refer to the last slide of Britt-Marie's presentation or the table, I think we're clearly in a situation which was described like in the upper right corner, like there is an actual risk, but there is no perception at all. Most people are not aware of radioactivity in building materials. It is not something of our current knowledge. In the same way as people are not aware of actually higher level of radioactivity in bottled water. They don't know about it. So should we keep it like that, or should we become transparent? I think the biggest mistake policymakers and industry representatives can make is thinking that if you would actually provide the information, that people would protest or reject it. I don't think it's true. People are clever enough to really understand what all these things mean. And I think they would find it more trustful if they also see these kind of things mentioned. And I agree with Rob in a more generalized way, of course, as in the same way as we now provide details on chemicals, for instance, additives in food. I think it would improve trust and a feeling of connection rather than scare off people. This is my opinion, of course.
Okay, thank you, Gaston. Turning to the questions that we have received so far, one of the questions really does seem to connect to this in the sense that it is a question which was inspired by this final slide from Professor Drottz-Sjöberg. And there the attendee points out or assumes that there is always a potential radiological risk as well, according to the linear radiological risk model, and any additional radioactivity is an additional risk, although below the legal norms. So does this always being present of this radiological risk then also imply that we need to communicate and include risk information on information sheets, for example? So I think this was primarily inspired by your presentation, Britt-Marie, but of course, if there's others who also want to respond to this, please let me know.
Well, it's a tricky question, of course, but if there is a system which people trust, and it's actually correct to trust authorities and experts giving the information and giving some kind of interpretation of this level of whatever material or radioactive activity there is, if that is trusted, there wouldn't be any reaction or problem to giving that kind of information, of course. But if you do not have authorities that are trusted, or maybe the issue is not researched at all, there is no information, and or if there is a controversy in media or in some other context that people get very upset about having or not having information, then it's of course a very different situation. So if there should be or shouldn't be information at some kind of safety data sheet is one aspect. I think one should be aware that it's important to have information available if such a situation comes up, and also be clear about who can give information and who is responsible for information, like Kelly underlined. Because situations can flare up quickly, and one should be prepared to give the appropriate information when needed. If that should be legislated or if that must be printed in a safety data sheet, I think that's a more bureaucratic question. I think experts and especially authorities should be aware of the potential situation where this would be a very important issue to give information about, and that the information is available at that time with a good communicator. I think that's what I say.
Okay, thank you. I saw that some other panelists also wanted to react to this. I think, Rob, you were the first to indicate.
You can hear me, I guess? Well, I think, of course, it is good to have information to the people, but I do think it's also important just throwing information over the wall and say, well, now we are transparent, etc., will not do the trick. If you give people information on the risks, then you should also supply them with some framework that they can assess the risk. Is it risky? Do I accept this risk or not, etc.? But just saying it contains whatever becquerel per kilogram is transparent and is true, but doesn't help them. So I do think if we have risk communication, a second step has to be taken, a framework where they can see, make their own choices whether or not they want to accept this risk. That was my point.
Okay, Rob, thank you for making that point. I also noticed Gaston who wanted to say something, and then Miguel, I also see that you indicated interest. So Gaston.
Yeah, maybe we can see the issue of transparency also from some kind of like more strategic way. If I may compare again with risk perception with nuclear accidents, and I know it's, I mean, I will immediately make clear how I compare it. The general awareness of a nuclear risk coming with peaceful applications like energy production of the public came with the Chernobyl accident. Before that, it was very fragmented, then it became general. It slipped away a little bit and it came back with Fukushima. Of course, we can't have accidents in the norm context, but we could have scandals, for instance, and where some kind of company is like using material and tries to really slip it through the controls and really skips regulation and so on. I mean, I'm just thinking out loud. We don't want that. So, so is the industry thinking about these things? Is it something the industry is vigilant about? Have there been any scandals already in that sense, or where like rules are violated? This is a question to the representatives in that sense.
Miguel, Ángel, I saw that you also showed an interest. I don't know if anyone can also respond to the final question that Gaston put forward. But yes, first I will give the word to you, Miguel Ángel.
Okay, thank you. Well, I would like to say a very extreme example. For instance, that everybody knows that tobacco kills, but you decide to smoke or not to smoke, but you know tobacco kills, and in all the advertisement is compulsory to put similar message. In our case, it's not the same because construction products made with norm don't kill. The radioactivity level is quite low, fortunately. And then our case is not a problem to be transparent because in many cases we are below the Euratom limits. And in our case, to take this decision of transparency is quite easy. Asking to Gaston, I can say that, for instance, the cement industry in Europe has decided to be clear and to be transparent. And there are many publications, and we have publications about cements, but also, well, Cristina Natticelli is here, one of the people attending this meeting. They have made a report, a huge report about NORM materials in Europe, not only cement, concrete, aggregates, gypsum, and so on. And they are transparent. We have this knowledge, we have all this information for scientists, but also the administration can take this information. I can ask to the industry to provide all these results. In my opinion, transparency in this topic is quite important because we are not a high level of radioactivity. We are a very moderate or very low level, and it's good to keep in touch with administration, with all the stakeholders. It's very important for the industry. And if we want to put these materials in the market and in a success way, we must be transparent and to give information. For consumers, well, a very low level, not very technical. For the administration, as they want, and for scientists, all the information they require. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Miguel. Ángel. I see that Wouter also wants to react.
Well, I want to stress not specifically regarding the use in building materials, but regarding the use of NORM or the storage of NORM, that there were accidents. For example, regarding the storage of red mud, we had a dam breach both in Hungary but also in China. There are many, let's say, contaminations linked also to mining or some improper processing in the past. So you can call them scandals or you can call them, let's say, disasters or any way you like. But it is important that the residues and the materials that they find solutions, that they find ways of use. There are always problems or potential problems that can be linked to the storage of waste or the storage of residues. And this itself can have a big impact on people living around. And that's, of course, also an important issue that needs to be dealt with. In a way, Europe is exporting some of its problems because we are maybe by sometimes over-regulating or making it resulting in causing the result that some of the practices from the phosphate industry, for example, are moving outside of Europe. And that can have a very big impact on the environment. And I think that's also an obligation that we have as Europe. We shouldn't only look at when we are regulating on the consequences of the, let's say, the safety or the impact locally, but also towards the rest of the world.
Okay, thank you, Wouter. Returning to some other questions that we received, I see that one question has led to quite some chatting in the chat area. I will try to very shortly summarize because it was directed primarily at Dr. Jones. And basically went into the topic of radon and whether or not radon should also be considered to be part of the relevant standards that Dr. Jones discussed in her presentation. So maybe Kelly, if you want to react on this.
So I should have mentioned in my talk that the activity concentration does not take into account doses from radon. So it was discussed at the beginning of when they were looking at what standards to formulate to produce the standard, but it's not easily done. So it was kind of decided, right, going to develop these two standards first of all, and then maybe come back and look at that. I can also see that there's a comment about the standard that I mentioned about gamma ray spectrometry. So sorry if that's not the latest title of that standard. I'll just double check what the most current name of that standard is. And the comment also mentions that about the cost of do we want to have an expensive way of having detectors for controlling norm. I mean, a lot of labs do have access to semiconductor and gamma ray spectrometry, but I think that there is an issue about how expensive do you want to make it to be. But I mean, I don't know if Miguel can comment on how the construction industry views radiation. Is it just another thing that you have to deal with, and it's not a big deal, or is this seen as another onerous thing that you guys have to do? Sorry, I asked a question myself there, but I'm interested.
Well, I can tell you only a few things that well, radon, well, also not only in Europe, also in the States, is taking into account in the regulations, but the limit is about 400 becquerels cubic meter, and the way to measure this is in a different way. As everybody knows, there is a close relation between the radium amount in the soil and the exhalation of radon. And also this is another topic that there are several barriers against radon. And well, there are several products that in many countries now is compulsory to use this. When it's detected in many areas where granite is the main component of the soil or other radioactive materials are in the soil, is compulsory to build using these barriers against radon. There are several patents related to this. But the question is very specific. Also, there is a question about the methods that, well, I can tell you that the Wouter is a person from Finland is in the TC 351 working group 3. He's the person in charge of this, and probably well, I can give you the email and you can ask directly, because it's very specific, very technical, this question. I know that they are developing now these standards. I know that at the beginning this standard were pre-standards, experimental standards, and now are full standards. And all these methods are developing right now, are now in question.
Yeah, I'm not aware of a standard being developed, but I'm not on that particular working group. But I can ask that question, and I'm happy to share it with the attendees, unless one of the attendees. I don't know if any of the attendees is on that working group.
Okay, thank you. So we can also continue this in the chat, of course. There was another question, again, dedicated to the topic of communication, where one of the panelists and one of the attendees, and I will again summarize this, pointed out that we are often speaking about communicating to a general group, but the attendee points out that, of course, there's many differences in terms of categorizations of this general public, and should we therefore develop different approaches or communication approaches to these specific target groups, or is it still preferable to develop a more general approach to a public in general? I don't know who wants to react on that first. Yes, Britt-Marie.
I think there is a lot of risk communication approaches that are available and well tested in the field, in many fields, in environmental aspects, nuclear aspects of public reactions or reactions from other groups. So, well, it has been done work for at least the last 25, 30 years on this subject area. And I think the consensus is that communication should be tailored in a way to those that are to be communicated with, and that's a different thing than those who should be informed generally. So there are a lot of approaches, and of course the main thing is that people understand if it is producers, if it is specific research groups, if it is general public, if it is worried parents. The format and the language should be accustomed to those receivers. And also, I would like to underline the importance of listening to what are people's concerns, if there are concerns, so that exactly those concerns are addressed in such a communication. So my main point is that there are a lot of approaches, and it has been tested for quite a lot of years. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Rob, you also wanted to react?
Yes. Just a question to Britt-Marie. We're discussing now communication, and do think that we are the only one who can communicate the information, but you have a lot of other sources like Twitter, Facebook, etc., with their own theories. Britt-Marie, do you have some idea how we can handle that type of communication or sources?
If I may, yes. That's a very good point. And that's what I meant a little bit by saying it's important that the ones that have the reliable information are putting themselves forward as the reliable sources, because I don't think there is a way to control or monitor or any way influence what's happening in other media or social media. So that's a trick really, to be first first, you know, on the toes to say that this is what we do and make that credible. And in this connection, I would like to say that it's very important that those concerned are informed about how the monitoring systems work, because if you do not trust that the rules and legislations that are available are actually in place and monitored by experts and authorities, then the whole point is missed. So information should also include these chains of monitoring and how various kinds of authorities actually work to uphold safety, given that the rules and regulations are the best ones, of course. Thank you.
Okay, so just as a very short follow-up to something which has been said just now. So indeed, when we tend to talk about communication, as we have also done today, we often tend to think in terms of we provide information to a certain group. However, it has also been pointed out that we then of course need to know the interests of this group. So I would be interested to know how to best capture these interests. What groups should we talk to, and how should how could they be involved in this process? Is there anyone who wants to have a short reaction on this? I see that Britt-Marie is willing to provide her thoughts. Thank you.
Well, I think in this context, the producers are a very good group to have a good communication with. As we heard, there have been examples of misconduct from some sources in the field, and one should be aware that that kind of information spreads quickly. So the signal here is to be aware that problems can arise, and information is good to have available already. And I'm sure quite a lot of producers in various areas here would like to have some, not guidelines, but some kind of help in how do we do this? What is it that we should think about? Just to help out and to be ready when something happens, because I'm sure, as in all kinds of life, there will be those who misuse rules and put a CE stamp on the product that isn't checked, and that will have serious consequences for the whole industry, for example. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Britt-Marie. So I see that we are now slowly approaching 2 o'clock and the end of the webinar. So before we close down, I would like to give the word to Karen Smith, who has been following this entire webinar and who will provide a wrap-up of what has been said until now. So Karen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Robbe. You can hear me? Yes, thank you. I want to say that this is a fascinating set of discussions, and thank you to all the panelists and to our participants. I've learned a lot and been taking a lot of notes. I'll try hard to capture what I think is the essence of what we've discussed. We've heard from a number of the panelists of the opportunities to reuse, recycle some of the byproducts from certain industries that generate norm materials. And that reuse can lead to the increased sustainability both of those generating industries, but also of the building and construction sectors. And that's important. We heard good information from Wouter and Miguel and Ángel about the economics that could be achieved in terms of valuation of these byproducts and circular economy. We also learned about the environmental benefits, particularly related to carbon reductions moving forward. So those touch on 2 of the 3 pillars of sustainability, and they're really important to us. Rob did a good job, though, of balancing some of those opportunities against the realities of the construction and building sectors, pointing out that they tend to be conservative and very competitive. So it will not be without some challenges to those industries to begin integrating these byproducts and residues into new building materials. But that touches on the first 2 pillars of sustainability, the economics and the environmental benefits. So we really then get to the essence of this webinar, which is to talk about the social aspects, the 3rd pillar of sustainability. And that, of course, is critical. You can't really have sustainability without achieving all 3. And Kelly did a good job of giving us an understanding of the legislation and regulations and guidance and standards that are being put in place and being developed to address the risk and make this reuse and recycle appropriate activities. And that's good. And I think all of those things combine, the economics, the environmental aspects, the fact that legislation is being developed or is already in place, they get to some of the things that Gaston talked about in terms of ethics and the justification for reuse of these materials. But we do need to look at the big issue of risk and risk communication. And I think what I heard is all the panelists are in agreement that these industries need to take a very proactive approach in being transparent about the materials that are being used so that they can build trust with the consumers and confidence in the materials and lead to acceptance of these materials in the markets. But more importantly, also to address the right to information and the right to have informed consent on the part of the consumers. That's all in agreement. And then we all also seem to agree that there are many complications associated with that risk communication. And Britt-Marie did a very good job of explaining the need for trusted, reliable sources of information being communicated to various stakeholders in a manner that they can understand and accept and then take on board. And that there are different methods that should be tailored to the individual recipients, the stakeholder groups, and also to the risk scenario that you sit in. What part of the matrix are we in that Britt-Marie showed us? Gaston argues we're in the upper right corner where there is in fact risk and very little understanding. So how that risk communication is done is going to be critical to the success of this type of reuse and recycle. You need to be able to clearly communicate to the consumers the economic and environmental benefits, but also the risk. And you need to be able to address the uncertainty associated with that risk calculation. And that's a very difficult thing to communicate clearly to stakeholders while also building trust in the system. So it will be a very delicate balance moving forward. How to communicate will be critical. There are many different methods. But as Gaston said, it's important that we have a dialogue, not just a transfer of information, but a dialogue with the stakeholders that leads to that sense of transparency and trust. I'm sure I missed many critical points, but I think I'll stop there and allow you to add to it, Robbe, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you for this very eloquent wrap-up of what has been said by all our panelists. I would just like to end this, this session very shortly by pointing out that the topic of today's webinar will also be one of the subtasks which will be investigated in the RadoNorm project, which has officially kicked off yesterday, actually, from the 1st of September onwards. And that together with the University of Hasselt, we have a PhD, which will be particularly dedicated towards this topic of societal aspects and marketing challenges. If you want to have a look at the vacancy, which is still open until the 17th of September, you can find it on the SHARE website. Other than that, I can also point towards other events which are now being organized online in the RICOMET context. So later today, we have a consultation on citizen science. Tomorrow, there is a session on the update of the strategic research agenda, to which I can also invite you all. And then I think the final thing for me to say is to thank you to all the panelists which have been here with us today. Also to Karen Smith, who was here with us today in a very early hour for her because she's based in the States, so it's very early day there. I also want to thank all of those working behind the screens to make all of this possible. And then finally, I want to thank the audience for being here with us today. So hope to see you all in a future event, and thank you to all of you.